It's 8:15 a.m. We are all getting through it with some strong coffee. Thanks very much, Bridget, and to Dave and others with the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade for pulling this event together. This is the third year now that I've been attending this event, and it's always great to come to Vancouver to talk about natural resources. It's been really notable, I think, just to see the shift over the last 3 years around the dialogue of natural resources and the importance that they play in BC's economy, and that's more important now than ever, as evidenced by budget on Tuesday. So I'm Richard Wong with CAP. I spend a lot of time focusing on policy and regulation and on competitiveness, and spending a lot of time politely talking to governments about why everything needs to go a bit faster and a bit cheaper, a bit cleaner, a bit simpler, no pressure. This panel is about natural resources as a growth lever, and in BC, that's not theoretical. The province, with respect to our sector, has been quite clear. LNG and natural gas are central to BC's economic and trade ambitions. The Look West strategy, trade missions to Asia, the demand signal is loud and clear. By 2030, BC is targeting about 29 million tons per annum of LNG exported. Federally, that ambition rises to 50 by 2035, 100 plus by 2040. And that's the vision, that's the shared vision with governments, with Indigenous partners, with industry. But there's also another part of the story that we don't say out loud, which is there are two ends of the pipe. There are the LNG terminals on the coast, but there are also upstream natural gas developments happening in the Northeast. And if one moves faster than the other, the math and that investment case just don't work out. Today, BC produces about 7.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. Over 90% of that comes from the Montney Formation in the northeast of BC. We drill roughly 500 wells a year, which is about what it takes to manage declines. But if we want to build out all of the LNG projects that the province has talked about, provincial gas production could potentially increase by 50% by 2030, up to doubling by 2035, and directionally meaning that demand is going to require thousands of additional wells over time, new processing facilities, new pipelines, power, roads. The whole value chain needs to hang together, and that's billions of dollars in private investment, long-term jobs, Indigenous economic participation, and ultimately a stronger fiscal base. But that only works if the system can scale. Right now, we're hearing from our members real concern about things like permitting timelines, land use plans, disturbance caps, systems that weren't designed for this level of future activity. And even the Minister Dix, who couldn't be here today, has acknowledged that risk and acknowledged that if we don't move faster as BC, that capital and that market share will potentially go elsewhere. That conversation isn't ideological, it's practical. And so the question is, how do we translate ambition into execution? And that is why today's panel, I think, really matters. We've got leaders who get to see this process from ideation to project delivery. They'll dig into what needs to change, what's already moving, where collaboration is actually delivering results. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have Selena Basi, Vice President of Corporate Relations with Woodfibre LNG. We have Mike Carrucan, CEO of Elk Valley Resources. We have Mark Urwin, Executive Director, Energy, Economics and Royalties with the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions. Mark, I will say your title is the only one that goes over two lines on this. And moderating the discussion, we have Malcolm McPherson, who's a partner with McPherson Law, LLP. So I'll welcome our panelists to the table, or to the stage, pardon me. This is a really big conversation, but I think it's a solvable one. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
welcoming us in, Bridget and Malcolm. So as mentioned, my name is Selena. I'm responsible project located just up the Sea to Sky Highway. So Woodfibre LNG is a LNG project. Will be the second exporting LNG project in Canada, which is really exciting. Hot on the heels of the LNG Canada mega project that started exporting Canada's first LNG cargoes last year. We're a smaller facility positioned to deliver 2.1 million tons per annum into global markets as of 2027. We are partnered with the Squamish Nation. Always love to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Squamish Nation is actually a first of its kind regulator on our project, so that's something that I'd love to discuss a little bit here on this panel as we're discussing the uniqueness and competitiveness of doing this type of industrial work in British Columbia. We're also located within a really unique geopolitical and social context in Squamish. Just so you know, not everybody loves us in Squamish. So we have had a real opportunity to rise to the challenge of building an industrial facility in a town that is very sensitive to what we're doing in terms of being an energy project. And we've, at 50%, 60% construction completion, really demonstrated how you can build a project of this nature without impacting the community. So looking forward to digging into that as part of today's discussion as well. What else can I tell you about the project? It's exciting times for this sector. I just got back last couple of days from an overseas trip to Singapore where our company is headquartered. And I can tell you this conversation is live across the world, and it's really important that we're holding time and space for it this morning. So thanks to everyone for being here.
Thanks, Selena. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, Mike Carrucan, pleasure to be here. Nice to see everybody. Elk Valley Resources is people would probably remember it as the old Teck coal business, or the previously Teck coal business. So we have 4 operations operating in the Elk Valley. So that's in the southeastern corner of British Columbia. We operate in the Rocky Mountains. Mining's been going on in that area for over 100 years. So, we're continuing that strong tradition that's been going for a very long time. We produce about 25 million tons each year of steel-making coal. So steel-making coal, for people who don't know, is different from thermal coal. We're not producing energy with it. We're making steel. And that steel is critical for the decarbonisation of the world. You can't build wind turbines without steel, all of those sort of things. So we are critical to the net zero sort of pathway. We have 5,500 employees working in the Elk Valley, so we're a very large business and we're a key driver for the economy in that area. So I came to the role of CEO when Glencore bought a 77% stake in the old Teck coal business, and I was working in the Australian coal business for Glencore. So I'm the token Aussie up here on the panel, but I am cheering for Canada in both the women's and men's ice hockey. So I wanted to get the audience on side. Okay. So.
Thank you, Mike. Over to you, Mark.
And thanks for that. Good morning, everyone. Mark Urwin, so Executive Director in the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions. My team balances sort of 3 tricky files in some sense. And Richard, apologies for my long title, because there's actually a third part to that we don't even capture entirely. But energy economics, so my team spends quite a bit of time sort of sinking into domestic, international markets, understanding sort of what's going on out there and the whys. So having to explain that to executives across government and to ministers, like why are we seeing companies knock on our door? Why do we see other countries interested in our resources? Some very important questions there. The royalty side is another important file for the government. One that we're currently modifying, but my team sort of holds or works in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance for the regular operations. So I have a pricing team that looks at domestic pricing, has a very good understanding of sort of the ins and outs of what's going on in the marketplace. And finally, I guess the piece that isn't captured in that title is around energy infrastructure. So we spend a lot of time understanding, working closely with a lot of projects that are advancing in the province, be it some of the LNG projects like Woodfibre, but we also, my team also holds the Trans Mountain office. So we are very close to a lot of the infrastructure that really is the backbone to our energy industry here in the province, and will become one of the driving forces for our energy industry moving forward. So really excited for the conversation, and over to you, Malcolm.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I'll provide just some opening framing context. Start with the forest, and then we can get into the trees, proverbial trees. So BC's natural resource sector is obviously, I'm going to state the obvious here, operating in a far more competitive and uncertain global environment than even, say, 5 years ago. Capital is mobile. Money obviously flees to certainty. Supply chains are shifting. U.S. trade policy is quite unpredictable. And at the same time, there's expectations around environmental performance, and Indigenous participation is rightly rising. So really the broad question for today is not whether resources matter, but whether BC can compete. So that's the sort of the framing context here. With that said, I'll just have prepared a series of questions just to get us going. So I guess the first question, and anyone can answer first, is if the U.S. tariff uncertainty becomes the new normal, where is BC most exposed, and what is the most important lever we control eventually to reduce that exposure? Does anybody want to jump on that?
Well, I'm happy to
Okay,
start,
yeah,
kick it off.
right on.
So, look, I think for our business, I think, well, if you look at Canada more generally, 75% or about 3/4 of the trade is going to the US. And I think that is obviously, everybody realises that that has changed. The relationship has changed fundamentally in the last year or two. So our business is really an export business to the rest of the world. A very small amount goes into the US. And that, I think, is, it's through infrastructure and enabling industry to get to ports, to go to other markets other than the US. I think we do need to be concentrating on how does government create an enabling environment to encourage export industries other than going to the US, would be my view.
Absolutely. Any other comments?
Echoing sort of the trade diversification side, like opening to new markets is going to be key for us. Historically, you mentioned our trade to the U.S., 75%. Looking in some of the energy space, and I'll pick on natural gas specifically, over or roughly 90% of the natural gas produced in British Columbia today moves outside of the province, right? Only a small portion is used domestically. We've estimated that roughly 50% of that actually makes its way into the U.S. Now, energy, given that it's a foundation to our economies around the world, it's somewhat protected against some of the tariffs we've seen so far, right? However, I'll throw in there is, we don't know what the future is going to hold. And if anything, we need to continue diversifying, opening up to new markets. And we've seen that through our premier going over to Asia and India most recently, and a strong appetite from those markets for BC, for Canadian natural resources, right? Sending those initial signals is key. Market participants in those markets want to know that the government's behind the sectors, the government's behind the projects. And I think having a premier and having a prime minister who's made their way into those markets is going to be one of the key first steps we need to be seeing to make sure that we are getting access to those markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about our prime minister, right, recent trade missions to China fairly recently, and I believe Mexico recently as well. If we think about what's happened in Venezuela as well, right? Mm-hmm. The U.S. Now has access to that sort of, if I describe it, sort of sticky crude, right? And that was always what we did in Canada. Is we always sent our sticky crude to be refined, and to state the obvious, diversification is really imperative. Before I turn to the next question, Selena, did you want to chime in?
Sure, I'll comment on that. Certainly, I think we've been fortunate in Canada that we haven't been compelled to consider trade diversification as urgently as we are now. And as is mentioned, I think the Prime Minister is sending really strong signals and taking action about what that's actually going to look like in the world markets. Before I took this job, I worked with Mark in the BC government, and I remember sitting there in COVID looking at, okay, where are we going to diversify? How are we going to change our markets? And I think the biggest message that is important for all the leaders in this room to carry out is we can't go back. So the situation with the US is what it is. It's going to likely ebb and flow, but the new reality is what it is. And, you know, Prime Minister has dubbed us accurately the middle powers. So we need to really look at what is our new reality? What is the world going to look like? Because trade diversification doesn't happen in 6 months. It's a long-term investment in those relationships. It's a long-term investment in developing our resource sectors, our emerging industries here like LNG. So I think what I would say is if the situation with the US becomes a new normal or not, it doesn't really matter. You know, I again mentioned we're owned by a Singaporean headquartered company, and when the investor came to Canada back in 2012, saw that situation himself from doing business in continents across the world, that this is a country with a stranded resource in natural gas. We need to monetize this resource for the benefit of our own citizens. It's a competitive world out there. Everyone is looking at this. Everyone is thinking this. We need to diversify. We need to get away from our reliance on the US. And so I think in terms of that normalizing, becoming the new reality, we're already there. We've been there for 5 years. It just hasn't been as loud as you see every day now when you wake up on X or Twitter. So I think the message that I have heard in conversations that I've been in around the world is don't look back, just keep going.
Yeah, very good comments. I agree. One has to look forward and positively too. I guess that the glass is half full in the sense that we've been selling our commodities at a discount because of the proximity, and yeah, that will obviously change. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Selena, there's a sort of climate-friendly aspect to it. The world needs more Canadian, responsibly produced LNG, right, to meet certain offset requirements and targets. With that being said, we'll move to question 2 here. And this next question addresses speed and standards here. So investors compare BC to Australia, the US, to South America, where our permitting timelines costing us competitiveness, and how do we materially shorten them without lowering environmental standards? So we've talked earlier today just about there's this race to diversify, right? This strong imperative. What's in the way, and how can we make some helpful suggestions to the regulators and the policymakers and the politicians? Who would like to start?
I think I'm a listener on this one.
I'll jump in as someone who's just obtained probably over 100 permits on a major project over the past 3 years. Yes, it's a hindrance to our competitiveness. I think one of our permits was to start putting pipe down on a greenfield location on our site, and that took over a year to get permitted. So when you think about the whole interdependencies of everything that has to happen in a major project, and you look at each individual permit that you have to obtain from each regulator, and love our friends in the BC government dearly. There was a union strike this year. There was a prolonged holiday period this year. There's hockey on tomorrow, so a lot of people aren't working. And every day costs millions of dollars, let's be frank. So I do think that the permitting, again, I've been at these tables for a long time. Our good friends at GVBOT, our good friends at BCBC, regulatory efficiency has always been the buzzword. What does it actually mean? It means when you need something, because we're so heavily regulated in this country, you need it quickly. So the signals that we're seeing out of the federal government with the establishment of the Major Projects Office, that's a great signal. We have had a lot of success based on sort of just the relationship capital that we have with the federal government in terms of making those things go faster, but it's incredibly complicated. And if you're looking from an international investor lens looking in, and you're looking at those other jurisdictions, it costs time, it costs money. You know, when I think about our marine works, so Woodfibre LNG is a water access only site, and we're creating an LNG export terminal in one of our last remaining deep sea ports. On the government side of things, you would think, let's do that as quickly, efficiently as possible. We're extremely environmentally sensitive. We have, again, the most robust marine mammal monitoring program anywhere globally, yet it takes a really long time to do anything. We're restricted to doing in-water works in only 4 months out of the year. And so when you look at those things and you look at the layering on of hundreds of millions of dollars, it does challenge us in terms of a competitiveness framework. And I think, again, we're seeing positive signals out of government that they acknowledge that and they want to do something to address regulatory efficiency. So what does that look like? I think we'll dig into that later in the conversation, but substitution, it looks like concurrent permitting, it looks like what makes sense for your project in its unique geographic and Indigenous context, and bespoke solutions are going to be necessary. We can't let up on the rigor of our regulatory framework because that's actually part of what makes Canada and our products a unique offering, but something does have to give. Again, and I say this after 3.5 years of obtaining hundreds of permits to just be able to construct something that's really good for the country.
Well, thanks for that answer, Selena. Yeah, it really rings true what you've said. I often, wonder aloud, like, how do countries like Norway, they seem to, get it right. And as Canadians, I think we're hard on ourselves, be an observation. I think we beat ourselves up quite a bit, but, clearly we're looking after the environment. So, Mike, maybe you can jump in. How do we speed this up? We've heard there's all this red tape.
Well, I guess I bring a perspective comparing the Australian permitting processes to BC. And I think there's two aspects I think that you touched on there. One is the efficiency of delivering the permits. It's also the number of permits, 100 permits. It's an overly complex system that we've got here in terms of having to get multiple permits to do activities. If you're in the Australian context, you have a one-stop shop between federal and state, and a mine or a project, an LNG project, would get a permit which was outcome-based in terms of its environmental performance, but you can do everything within that box. You get that, and then you can start the project. That's the major difference I see between Australia and BC. It's just that degree of complexity. And I think, but on the flip side of that, if you want to look at government, I think the messaging that we're getting from the federal and provincial governments is that they want to be open for business. They do want resource projects going ahead, and I think that they've just got to find a way to make that happen. That's not necessarily the case in Australia. Australia really do not love resource projects. It's quite strange for a country that is well endowed with resources, but the governments there are taking an approach which is less favourable to industry than it is here. So that's a positive, I think, coming out of both federal and provincial governments.
That's a great answer, Mike. So I saw Mark carefully taking notes. He wrote one window efficiency, I think, if I could see.
And I very much appreciate the feedback, sort of insights from Selena and Mike on that. Like, it's, as we've seen our resource sector build out, as we've seen the growth of the LNG sector here in British Columbia, and with that, the expansion of natural gas. So I know Richard mentioned that we're producing about 7.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas today. If you go back 10 years, we were around 3. So we've seen activity in the Northeast doubling already, right? And with the further build out of LNG in the province, like, that's going to grow. And with that, the permitting issue is going to be front and center. Certainly my minister is very aware of that. He is regularly having conversations with his peers. So if you look across BC government, typically for, say, a pipeline, you're looking at 5 or 6 different ministries that are going to be issuing permits to that. Throw in an LNG facility and you start layering in parts of the federal government, right? Selena, you mentioned substitution for the environmental assessment. I think that was one of the first big lessons that we had, a first big win, to the point you made, Mike, sort of making a one-stop shop for that first piece. But then it's actually getting, the operate, or as you look to construction and then to operations, you still have these multiple jurisdictions with multiple rules, and finding a way to harmonize that is, I'm interested to learn more about the Australian experience, but equally, I think it's making sure we continue to move forward and build out that relationship with the federal government, and making sure that we are not only having that common vision, but that message is working its way through the system, and those permitting agencies are talking to one another, and working as collaboratively as possible. We've tried to do some innovative things, certainly as we saw Trans Mountain get built out, where you're trying to find or identify where duplication's happening and find a way to streamline that. Not always easy, but unless you identify it, you can't move forward, as Selena said. So I'm taking notes.
That's a great answer. I'm going to spice things up a little bit. I'm going to shift to sort of the Indigenous sphere and overlay it here. So from a capital markets perspective, does DRIPA increase uncertainty, or does it ultimately create stronger long-term project stability once alignment is achieved? This is quite the topic, very topical. I was actually, because as I mentioned earlier, I represent around 20 nations. I was at dinner last night, and anyway, won't get into those details, but who would like to start with this question?
Well, I'll speak to it. Look, I think at the moment it's creating an enormous uncertainty. I think obviously that wasn't intended when DRIPA was put in, but I think we're in a position now, due to the court decisions that we're seeing, where there is a lot of uncertainty. And one thing capital markets abhor is uncertainty. Glencore's a global company. It has the ability to put funds into lots of jurisdictions. And when you're making decisions on where to put that capital, if you don't have a clear pathway and regulatory certainty, then it's going to be a real problem. So I don't know what the answer is, but I can tell you that uncertainty, you can see it through the industry associations. There's a massive concern out there in lots of industry sectors about that. And that's just the reality of it at the moment, I think.
I would agree. Again, coming from an overseas conversation a week ago, it's one of the most asked questions is, well, how do you deal with your Indigenous regulatory framework in British Columbia? How do you make investments when it's very unclear? And having discussions and dialogue with governments. I've worked in Indigenous relations for almost 20 years, and it's confusing to me. So absolutely, it's going to be confusing to someone from an investor perspective looking in. I was in the Premier's office on Monday having a conversation around the recent court decisions and government looking to provide clarity to the investment sector. What do you mean people think BC is uninvestable?
Right.
So I think it's a very topical conversation when you sit down with somebody and you say, well, the recent court decisions are actually, one's about DRIPA, and it's really about the intention of DRIPA, and the other one's about Section 35. What does that mean to someone that is just looking at their overall investment portfolio and where they're going to put capital in? So yes, it's an incredible uncertainty. However, I do think that if you're focused on being here and investing in British Columbia for the right reasons, it doesn't matter, because the relationship with your Indigenous partners is just that. It's about the relationship. It's a foundation, which becomes a relationship, which becomes a friendship, which becomes a partnership. And in that case, you can create your own bespoke version of DRIPA. So again, I mentioned our relationship with the Squamish Nation. It's very unique to have an Indigenous nation as a regulator on your project. And I know a lot of our partners in industry are, oh, why would you guys do that? Now you've set this new standard. But it does create certainty. I won't say it's easy. I won't say it makes it streamlined, what I would say is that it creates a framework where you know what to expect and you know how to move forward. So I think that while the policy landscape is confusing, making that investment into that relationship with who you're going to be working with for the long term. Again, these projects aren't short. These aren't a cut a deal and you're done. They're a long-term foundation that then builds into a long-term relationship. And if you find a way to navigate that, you do have certainty and you do have an ability to build a really robust project.
Really, really great answers. You know, I'm a lawyer, as I mentioned at the outset, and I have to say that, you know, when I first read DRIPA, I also thought it was not exactly imbued with certainty, right? I mean, without getting into a long discussion about it, I mean, it's supposed to sort of align, you know, I guess, international laws with, in the case of federal laws, because there's a federal DRIPA component, and then of course BC passed its own law. But I always sort of saw it as something that would take, you know, a decade plus to really understand. Sort of like the charter took so many years to sort of understand what it meant. And I'll tell you, at the, you know, last night at the dinner table, you know, there was concern expressed just about, I guess, the revisions that are likely forthcoming to DRIPA. And I'll tell you, there's the chorus is it's all about a pay and a say. Sort of simplify things in my head. And yeah, it you know, it seemed to be just from a fixing things perspective, focus really ought to be placed in passing legislation that perhaps brings more certainty, especially with respect to Indigenous inclusion, right? Having a say over the activity, right? Whether it's you know, a mine or oil and gas, etc. And then also, you know, the pay component, because you've got the effective reality is that you've got all this case law. You've got you know, Supreme Court case law. You got Delgamuukw, right, that talks about an inescapable economic component. You fast forward to Cowichan, right, in Richmond. There's clearly a tie, but it hasn't yet been addressed through the laws yet, and perhaps we'll get into that a little later. So anyway, I'll pause there because I'm not a panelist, and move on to the next question here. You know, I'm just going to move to regulation and policy reform because we have about 11 minutes left here. I'm just going to ask if you could identify one regulatory or fiscal policy that is currently misaligned with BC's competitiveness. What specifically would you change, and why would you change it? This is the problem-solving aspect.
Well, I think we could create a one-stop shop similar to the Australian model. I think we would see real gains out of that. Again, I know the Major Projects Office was announced, gosh, almost 6 months ago. Kind of remains to be seen how that's going to be all harmonized. I think the answer is pretty easy from a regulatory efficiency perspective. From a fiscal policy perspective, I know there's a lot of talk out there around subsidizing industry. I do think that for our industry, which is the LNG industry, which is an emerging industry, it's sort of been stunted in its growth. I think everyone in this room knows that we could have had a very, very robust burgeoning industry if we kind of gone all in about 15 years ago. The industry is still growing, and so fiscal policy is required to help support an industry that's going to set us up for the next generation of billions of dollars of revenue generated for government and hundreds of thousands of jobs in this sector. So I won't comment on exactly what fiscal policy that is, but I think it's evident that there's a competitiveness gap to produce LNG off the west coast of Canada as you compare it to the Gulf Coast of the US. We're looking at approximately a $4 MMBTU gap, which is significant. And I do think that both regulatory and fiscal investments from federal and provincial government is going to drive us forward.
Well, from a fiscal point of view, I think the most important thing is to ensure when you're trying to export to lots of overseas markets is you want to be competitive. I think one good example is carbon pricing in BC. You know, our carbon bill is going to double in the next 2 years. With that might not seem a great deal to some people, but it just adds cost to our business. It's going to add another $2 a tonne to our costs. That is creating a non-competitive situation for us in overseas markets. There is no green premium that's applied to our product. That hasn't materialised. And I think if there's one thing the government could do is to try and remove some of those things. I know they're struggling for revenue. We saw the budget. But in the end, it's also about having technically feasible things you can do about carbon as well. So we struggle with that, and we're just going to end up with a cost impost. So that's one example in the fiscal area. I think in the regulatory sense, I think what we'd like to see is both federal and provincial governments starting to stand up and stand behind the resource industry. I think for too long we've been seen as the bad guys, and when, you know, we do a lot of really good work in terms of managing the environment, working with First Nations. All of that stuff has moved a long way, and I think we'd like to see the government, both federally and provincially, sort of getting behind resource projects. We know that they, you know, if you look at that budget that I just referred to get out of the hole that we're in, we're going to need to get more industry going, because that's where you're going to generate jobs, you're going to generate revenue through taxes, company taxes. And at the moment, you know, there's been a lot of really good talk federally and provincially, but I think now we need to see some action in terms of that regulatory sort of processes.
Well said, Mike. Yeah, I mean, if you just, you know, you open, well, I guess no longer physical papers, but when you read the news, right, there's cutbacks everywhere. Federal government's, you know, slashing its spending. British Columbia, you know, doing the same thing. So obviously there needs to be sort of a refocus on sort of, you know, the job creation side of the equation, which leads me to just a question here from the audience. One is, and this ties in, is how is BC positioning itself to remain competitive as EU and Asian markets accelerate their energy transition timelines? It seems to me, and this I think was teased through some of the conversations, that like, there's a race that's going on, and it's a race to capture market share, right? So, you know, as we're beat ourselves up, you know, as good Canadians, and, you know, sort of follow all the right processes, we're still in this race. Perhaps I'll just leave it there. What do we do to make sure we're really in the race, and that we get market access, right, while that's being set up and not sewn up?
I think some of that will pivot to, in part, relationships. So, and recognizing which markets we have that access to, which markets we can best be feeding into. And certainly, you know, through Elk Valley, you know, you've been supplying met coal into China or into Japan, into Korea, you know, and that some strong relationships have been built there for your company and between the province and those countries. We're seeing the same kind of build out on the natural gas side with LNG exports now making their way into those markets, and for, you know, for what goes unknown for probably a lot of people is like the province of BC has been exporting propane into Japan and Korea for almost a decade now. You know, and after we started our first export facility, the first propane export facility, I say we, but it was really AltaGas and their partner Vopak. But as a country, we've become the second largest supplier of propane into Japan, right? Some massive inroads and providing energy security to those countries, right? So I think recognizing sort of what our strengths are and who we have those strong relationships with, and continuing to build that out. You know, the world's going to need more energy. The growth throughout Southeast Asia, pivoting over to India, is going to see a massive increase in the amount of energy required. That's going to come from the form of hydrocarbons. It's going to come from the form of renewables. Certainly, metallurgical coal is going to be supporting a lot of that through the building of pipelines or the building of wind turbines. Like, these are some of the strengths that we need to be leveraging, looking ahead. So,
No, thank you for that answer. We're just we're running against the clock here, so this will be the final question. I'll give each about a minute to answer, and perhaps we'll start with Selena. So, yeah, if you could summarize sometimes it's good to look at the obvious and to try and simplify things, although it's not always the answer. But what is the single most important structural change BC must implement in the next 3 years to ensure the natural resource sector remains a primary growth lever? If there was one thing you would identify, what would that be and why? And I'll ask each of you after.
So I think in terms of the internal work that needs to be done, we've talked a lot about the regulatory system, so I won't harp on that anymore, although that would be kind of my response. I think it's really looking at this Team Canada approach. And so we talk about we're in a nation building era. We talk about we're in a time of generational change. So what does it actually look like? You know, we've been calling on the federal government to develop a national natural gas strategy. What are the investments needed in infrastructure to power that industry? What are the investments needed in capital and talent? And so I think it's just really looking at, it's not going to happen by chance. We've talked about the fact that there's a lot of nations in this race, a lot of people around the world that think that, you know, they can step up and be the one to supply the growing demands of the Asian energy superpowers. So I think it's really an internal strategy is needed and then an external strategy, because we've talked about the resources that we have here. We have incredible natural resources. We have an incredible talent pool. We have something to offer to the world. We're really bad about talking about it. So I think it's both an internal and an external strategy are going to be needed to get us where we need to go in the next 3 years.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I think it's all about government, be it federal or BC, enabling industry really, and that's in multiple ways. You mentioned the trade to China and India. Like currently we pay a tariff there's a tariff on coal into both of those countries, 3% and 2.75%. Doesn't seem a lot, but that puts us on an uncompetitive footing with the Australian competition. That might sound like I shouldn't say that, but yeah, we're competing against Australian steel-making coal going into those markets. So it's about governments kind of creating that environment where we are as competitive as we possibly can be. And that includes the regulatory, the internal stuff, which is all about the permitting, and we've talked a lot about that. But I've come back to my point. It's time, I think, for both the federal and provincial governments to sort of stand behind resources projects and sort of put their efforts into creating efficient and less complex processes, which will then encourage capital investment in Canada.
Final word?
Final word.
No pressure.
Very much appreciate the insights from Mike and Selena there, and I'll pivot back to almost something that Richard mentioned, like looking at what our energy sector looks like and establishing a bit of I wouldn't call it a vision, but some targets looking ahead, right? If we're expecting the growth of our natural gas sector to, see a doubling in the coming years, what does that require? And sitting down in collaboration with the federal government, to Mike's point, to become the champions to help drive that forward, right? Being the voices that, be it on the international stage in Davos, where you can say, here's who we are and here's the role that we're going to be playing. But equal to that, not just saying the words, but, walking the walk, walking the talk as well. So,
Well, that's a great way to end it. It's time to walk the talk here. There's a race. It's an important race, and what's clearly come through as a moderator is that there's a need to accelerate the efficiencies that are lacking, and not just talk about it, but actually, streamline and try to get more of a one-stop shop approach. You've been a lovely audience. Thanks for listening today.